My name is Eric Talbot. I'm 45 years old. I serve in the United States Air Force as a Major General, though most people just call me Sir. I've spent most of my life working behind the veil, classified missions, delicate negotiations, and the kind of military intelligence that doesn't make it into textbooks. But none of that prepared me for the cold silence I walked into the day I returned to my childhood home. I came back on personal leave, expecting to find peace. What I found instead was a new man sitting in my father's old chair, my stepfather, Carl. Carl married my mother 5 years ago, after my father passed. I barely knew him. Our interactions had been surface level at best. Short video calls on holidays, maybe a birthday card or two. But as I stepped into the house that day, I could feel his eyes sweep over me like I was trespassing. He didn't rise to greet me, didn't offer his hand, just sat there, legs crossed, arms folded, like a king on his throne. Something in his expression told me this wasn't just about being territorial. This man wanted me to know I didn't belong there anymore. My mother greeted me warmly, but there was something off in her voice, a tremble, a caution, like she'd learned to walk lightly in her own home. I could tell she had become a guest in her own life. I asked how things had been, and her answers were rehearsed, vague. Carl interrupted often, correcting her, speaking over her, and making offhand remarks about how retirement suits some people more than others. I hadn't told them yet. I was still active. I rarely shared anything classified, even with family, but his condescension made my stomach turn. It wasn't long before Carl found reasons to belittle me. "You military types always think you're above the rest," he said while passing me a cold plate at dinner. "Bet you bark orders at your cereal too." I didn't respond. Silence is power. Let fools ramble. They always reveal themselves in time. I watched him closely. He enjoyed dominance, especially in subtle domestic ways. The thermostat, the groceries, even the television remote. Everything had to go through him. I saw how he relished small tyrannies, like they gave him purpose. And for the first time, I wondered what it would be like to live under someone like that every day. The tipping point came on the third day. I received a call, one of those urgent encrypted communications I couldn't ignore. I stepped into the study, closed the door, and began speaking with command. It was a matter of international sensitivity. I was mid-sentence, coordinating an immediate air transfer, when the door burst open. Carl stood there, red-faced, drunk on his own importance. "You think you can take private calls in my house?" he shouted. I calmly raised a hand, motioning him to leave, but he didn't leave. Instead, he yanked open a drawer, pulled out a pair of old handcuffs. Where he got them, I still don't know, and latched them around my wrists. What happened next was surreal. I stayed silent. I didn't struggle. I didn't shout. I simply let the call remain open. I knew they'd heard everything. The click of the cuffs, his shouting, his threats. I knew the line was monitored, and Carl had no idea who I was really speaking to, or what chain of command he'd just set into motion. I sat there, shackled to the desk, while Carl smirked like a child who thinks he's won a game he doesn't even understand. 5 minutes later, the rumble of black SUVs echoed down the street. The SUVs didn't pull up like a storm. They arrived like judgment, quiet, exact, and final. Their engines cut off in perfect unison, and the silence that followed was louder than any siren. I sat still in the chair, my wrists calmly resting in the cuffs Carl had so proudly locked onto me. He was still pacing, muttering something about teaching respect when he heard the first knock. No one bangs like that, unless they mean to rearrange a life. 3 sharp, purposeful raps on the door. I watched him flinch. His bravado flickered. Carl opened the door with a puffed chest and a smirk. That smirk didn't last long. Standing in front of him was Commander Reeves, one of the most decorated security officers in the Air Force. Behind him, 4 men in dark suits, earpieces coiled around their necks like silent serpents, and 2 military police officers flanking the walkway. "We're here for General Talbot," Reeves said without emotion. Carl's face contorted, unsure whether this was some prank or delusion. "General who?" he stammered. Reeves stepped inside without waiting for permission. "The man you handcuffed mid-clearance. Call to the Pentagon." Carl turned toward me like he was seeing me for the first time, but I didn't meet his gaze. I kept mine steady on Reeves. "At ease," I said. The team nodded and walked toward me, one of them pulling out a master key. I could see Carl starting to backpedal, his voice stumbling through apologies, saying he thought I was just playing soldier, that I was on leave and acting shady. But it was too late. You don't get to treat someone like dirt and then beg for mercy once the lights flip on. They unlocked the cuffs, and I stood slowly, adjusting my sleeves like I was brushing off the insult. My mother had appeared by now, her hands trembling, mouth ajar, clearly caught between fear and confusion. I turned to her gently. "It's all right, Mum," I said. "I didn't come here to start anything." Reeves glanced at me for confirmation. I gave the faintest nod. The protocol had changed. This wasn't an arrest. This was a response, an exposure, a warning without needing to say the word. Carl started yelling something about rights and authority, but no one was listening. He tried to command the room like he always had, but his voice carried no weight anymore. It was like watching a balloon deflate, his ego shrinking by the second. I stood in front of him, now free, now fully seen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult him. I simply said, "You really had no idea who I was, did you?" And then I walked past him, as if he were nothing more than furniture. Outside, the air was still. Reeves offered me a ride, but I declined. I wanted to walk. I needed the silence to absorb the moment. My mother followed me outside, tears streaking down her face. "Why didn't you tell me who you really were?" she asked. I turned to her softly, "Because the world only respects power when it's loud. I've learned it's better to let them talk, let them underestimate you, and then show them everything in one move." Carl watched from the doorway, pale and frozen. He looked smaller than ever. Long before that moment in the living room, I had sensed the rot setting in. Not just in Carl, but in the dynamic he'd created in my mother's life. I could see the subtle erosion, the way she stopped wearing color, how her voice trailed off mid-sentence when he looked at her, how she always asked permission instead of sharing joy. I wasn't there most of the time. My career kept me stationed abroad, but even from a distance, I could read between the lines. His control wasn't loud, it was surgical. I kept my concerns quiet, not because I was afraid, but because noise is rarely effective when the enemy thrives on chaos. Instead, I began gathering information. During visits home, I noticed patterns. Carl handled all the finances, redirected family mail, controlled phone access. My mother wasn't poor, not by a long shot. She'd inherited a sizable estate from my father, but she didn't seem to be enjoying any of it. That told me everything I needed to know. Carl had maneuvered himself into her world, not for love, but for leverage. I didn't confront him. That would have been too easy for him. People like Carl crave confrontation because it gives them a stage, a role to play. Instead, I went through the back doors. I reviewed the trust my father left behind, spoke with our longtime family attorney in private, and discovered Carl had been trying to quietly rewrite portions of it. He was sneaky, methodical, but nowhere near as clever as he thought. Every breadcrumb he left became a piece of a larger map I was now charting. With the legal side secured, I turned to the emotional preparation. I began checking in with my mother more frequently, asking gentle but direct questions about how she was feeling, not just what was happening. I needed to awaken the version of her that once taught me to stand tall, to finish what I started, to never apologize for being strong. I could tell those parts of her were still alive, just sleeping under the weight of someone else's dominance. So I became her mirror again, reminding her of who she had always been. Behind the scenes, I arranged for quiet protections. I moved some of her assets to secured accounts with her sole access under my name as trustee. I made sure that her healthcare, legal, and property documents had redundancies ones Carl couldn't find or touch. I never told her the full extent of what I was doing, not because I didn't trust her, but because I knew how people like Carl manipulate through confusion. If she didn't know where the levers were, he couldn't force them from her. And then I waited. Timing matters more than strategy. You don't dismantle a house from the outside. You wait until the frame is hollow, and then you tap the right beam. I didn't know the exact day Carl would overstep, but I knew he would. People like him always reveal their hunger. I just never expected it would be handcuffs during a Pentagon call, but sometimes the enemy builds their own guillotine. All I had to do was keep walking. The day after the SUVs left was eerily quiet. Carl barely came out of the bedroom. When he did, his eyes darted nervously, as if he expected every shadow to carry another uniform. The house no longer belonged to him, not in tone, not in silence. The fear in his body was palpable. He paced instead of strutted. He mumbled instead of boomed. And my mother? She walked differently too. Shoulders lifted a little higher, voice more sure. Something had shifted permanently, and Carl knew it. He tried to reclaim ground, of course. Cowards always do. He accused me of overreacting, of making him look bad. He tried to imply that the Pentagon call was a setup, that I had orchestrated everything just to humiliate him. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That's the thing about real consequences. They speak louder than any accusation. He'd embarrassed himself. I simply let him show the world who he was. He was unraveling fast, like a suit made of loose thread. A week later, my mother received a letter from her bank. Her access had been fully restored. Carl's name removed. I'd worked with legal to trigger those clauses. The moment he crossed the line, she didn't ask questions. She simply held the envelope, tears in her eyes, as if someone had just unlocked a door. She didn't know she was behind. That night, she cooked for the first time in a long time. A real meal. Candles. Music. It wasn't the food, it was the freedom behind it. Carl wasn't invited to dinner. He was in the den, sifting through drawers, pretending to search for something important. But there was nothing left for him to control. The accounts were secure. The deed to the house had reverted solely to my mother's name. The legal documentation he'd quietly tried to rewrite had already been corrected, reversed, and sealed. He'd lost every invisible string he once used to pull her back into silence. All without a single argument. Not one shouted word. That was the power of quiet revenge. By the end of the month, he attempted one last pathetic act of dominance, calling the police to report domestic tension. When the officer arrived and asked to speak to the homeowner, my mother stepped forward. Her voice didn't shake. She stated clearly that there was no violence, no emergency, and that the man standing next to her would no longer be welcome in her home. Carl stood frozen. The officer turned to him and asked him to step outside. That was the moment I knew it was over. He hadn't just lost control, he'd lost relevance. The next morning, I watched him load a single suitcase into his car. No fanfare, no apology, just silence. He glanced back at the house once, expecting anyone to stop him, but no one did. I stood by the window, arms folded, eyes steady. He didn't wave, he didn't speak, he simply drove away. That's how weak men leave quietly when their power evaporates. And as the sound of his car faded into the distance, I felt the final knot of tension uncoil inside my chest. After Carl left, the house breathed differently. The walls seemed to exhale, no longer holding in the weight of unspoken fear. Even the light felt cleaner, less like something filtered through tension, and more like a welcome presence. My mother walked into rooms without hesitating. She no longer paused before flipping a light switch or reaching for the television remote. The man who once dominated her space had become nothing more than a memory fading in the rear view, and he left behind only the silence of his absence. We didn't talk much about what happened. Some betrayals don't need retelling, they just need to be released. Instead, we focused on restoration. My mother took back her morning walks. She opened her wardrobe again, trying on colors she hadn't touched in years. Small things, yes, but powerful in their defiance. That's what healing looks like sometimes. Not fireworks, not a grand speech, just the quiet rebuilding of dignity one ordinary moment at a time. Meanwhile, I stayed close, not because she needed me, but because I wanted to be near the place that raised me right. I spent mornings reading in my father's old chair, the one Carl had claimed as his throne. And as I sat there, I didn't think of Carl. I thought of my father, of how he taught me to be firm without being cruel, strategic without being vindictive. That chair didn't belong to a tyrant. It belonged to someone who led with steadiness. I wasn't reclaiming it, I was returning it to peace. Carl, for all his venom, never tried to return. I think deep down, he knew the door was closed in every possible way. The world he once ruled over had outgrown him, shed him like a skin. I heard through a distant cousin that he was staying in a motel on the edge of town, spinning stories about betrayal and conspiracies, but no one called him, no one listened. His voice had always relied on control, and without it, he was just background noise, unremarkable, unremembered. One afternoon, I visited the lawyer again, not for revenge but for closure. I signed over all final documents ensuring my mother had total unshakable autonomy. She offered to make me co-owner of the house, to thank me, but I declined. This was never about possession, I told her. It was about protection. I didn't need the deed to feel like I'd won. Victory had already come in the form of her laughter, echoing through the hallway again. That was enough. I've learnt something through all of this. Power isn't about what you say, it's about what you choose not to say. I could have exploded, humiliated him publicly, filed charges, but instead, I let the truth do the talking. I let his own choices hand him the outcome. That's what quiet revenge really is. Not destruction, just the mirror turned back toward the one who tried to play God. And when they see themselves clearly for the first time, they collapse under the weight of their own reflection. Weeks passed, the dust had settled, but the lessons lingered. I stayed in town longer than I had planned. Not out of necessity, but because something had shifted in me. After years of serving across the globe, leading classified operations, and handling threats no one would ever know existed, I realized that the most personal battle I had ever fought took place in my childhood home, without a single weapon. And in that battle, the most powerful move I made was saying nothing. The community began to notice. People I hadn't seen in years stopped me at the market saying, "Didn't know you were still in the service." Or, "He always treated your mother strangely." They didn't know the whole story, of course. But they had sensed enough to recognize the shift. Carl's absence was like static clearing from a signal. Suddenly everything around the house made sense. People who once stayed quiet now nodded with respect. I didn't bask in it, I simply received it, quietly. My mother started volunteering again. I drove her once to the center where she helped organize books for underfunded schools. Watching her smile and laugh with other women, truly laugh, was one of the most rewarding moments of my life. We didn't talk about Carla. We talked about her favorite recipes, her travel dreams, even the dog she wanted to adopt now that the house felt whole again. She was rediscovering who she had been before silence became her survival. And as for me, something about the situation taught me a deeper kind of discipline. I had always associated leadership with control, clarity, and strength, but now I understood it also meant restraint. That sometimes your greatest strength isn't in retaliating, but in letting the storm scream itself out while you hold your ground. The uniform I wore back at base signified power, but what I wore at home, my patience, my silence, my refusal to become like him, was the real armor. Carl's name never resurfaced legally. He didn't contest anything. He didn't show up again. My guess is he realized too late that manipulation only works on those who don't see the strings. And once the strings are cut, the puppet master becomes just a man holding air. That's what he was now, air. No more threats. No more shadows cast over her life. Just a cautionary footnote in a chapter that was already closing. I left town a few days later, hugged my mother on the porch. She squeezed me tight and whispered, "Your father would have been proud." I looked at her and replied, "So would your younger self." And then I got in the car, not as a man who had returned to fix something, but as a son who had made sure the house he came from would never again be ruled by fear. A few months later, the quiet ended, not with Carl's voice, but with his desperation. I was back on base when I received a call from a private number. I almost didn't answer, but instinct told me this wasn't work. On the other end, Carl's voice cracked like glass under pressure. He spoke quickly, panicked, like a man running out of time. He said he was in trouble, financial, legal, and that people were turning on him. He never said sorry, not once. He only said, "I need a favor." I didn't speak right away. I let the silence stretch, just long enough for him to hear the weight of it. Then I said 4 words, slowly, clearly, without malice. "This line is monitored," and then I hung up. I never heard from him again. I didn't need to. That was his last card, and it didn't land. That's what people like him never understand. When you burn bridges, you don't get to use them when your house is on fire. That call wasn't a temptation, it was confirmation that he had finally fallen off the ledge he once made others tiptoe along. His world had collapsed under its own lies. I didn't have to push. I didn't even have to watch. That's the art of quiet revenge. You plant the truth and walk away. Let the wind carry the consequences. He was on his own now, in every sense of the word. Just a man with no leverage, no audience, and no respect. Back at base, I returned to my work. The mission continued. Lives to protect, operations to lead. But inside, I carried something I'd never had before, a profound sense of personal closure. I didn't just defeat an abuser. I dismantled a structure of control with precision, without ever becoming the monster I fought. That matters, because it's not enough to win. You have to win in a way you can live with. I started writing again. Not memoirs, those would come later. But small reflections, notes on restraint, on hidden strength, on the war between silence and ego. I didn't name Carl. He didn't deserve that kind of permanence. But I documented what mattered. How to identify manipulation disguised as charm, how to protect someone without stripping them of agency, how to wait without losing your edge. It became my personal field manual for emotional warfare. And maybe that's the true redemption. Not just that he left, but that we, my mother and I, rose from what he tried to bury us under. We reclaimed space, identity, dignity. And we did it without needing to roar, just by standing firm, refusing to be moved. Some victories are loud, others echo for a lifetime. A few weeks after that final call, my mother found an envelope on the front porch. No return address. Just her name written in Carl's unmistakable handwriting, crooked, too forceful, like everything he did. She didn't open it. She placed it on the table and looked at me. "Do you want to read it?" she asked. I shook my head. "No need," I said. "Whatever it says, it's not for healing, it's for control." She smiled faintly and slid the envelope into the fireplace without a word. The flames took it in seconds. It was a symbolic moment, not because we feared what he had to say, but because we no longer required his narrative. Carl had always been the type of man who thought the last word meant power. But true peace doesn't come from closure. It comes from disinterest, from realizing that the only thing more powerful than confronting a manipulator is not needing to. He had written his script in desperation, but we had already walked out of his story. I resumed my postings with a different kind of clarity. Operations became more precise. My command style softened in some areas and sharpened in others. I began mentoring younger officers, not just in tactics, but in composure, how to lead without dominance, how to detect power games even in diplomacy. I didn't tell them my full story, but I infused every lesson with it, whether they knew or not. Sometimes the battlefield isn't overseas, sometimes it's the kitchen table. My mother flourished. She sold some property Carl had tried to drain. She began painting again, something she hadn't done in over a decade. Her art was vibrant, strange, beautiful, full of things she couldn't say out loud, but could now express without shame. Her friends returned. She started hosting small dinners. No power games, no walking on eggshells, just presence, joy, freedom. That was the real inheritance my father would have wanted for her. Eventually, I received an offer to speak at a leadership summit, something I'd normally decline, but this time I said yes. I spoke not of war, but of silent battles, of dignity in the face of disrespect, of power that doesn't require noise. I ended the speech with a line that wasn't in the prepared notes. "There's a difference between being feared and being respected," I said. "Only one of those can survive in silence." The room was still. Not out of awe, but recognition. That's what I've come to believe. Real strength doesn't need to announce itself. It just stands quietly in the truth and waits. I never sought revenge against Carl. I just took away his stage. And when no one's watching, even tyrants crumble. Especially the ones who mistake silence for weakness. Months passed, the seasons changed, and Carl became nothing more than a name that occasionally surfaced in legal updates, bankruptcy notices, property forfeitures, unpaid debts. Each one arrived, like an echo of a man who once demanded the center of every room. Now he was a line item, a paper trail of failed schemes and burned bridges. I never responded to any of them. I had no interest in scavenging the wreckage he left behind. I had built my peace elsewhere. One day, while sorting through old files in my mother's study, I found a folder labeled in Carl's handwriting, crudely scrawled, "Insurance." Inside were documents, letters, forged amendments to estate terms, even recordings. It was a blueprint of manipulation, complete with timelines and backup plans in case my mother ever tried to reclaim what was hers. My hands didn't shake as I flipped through them. I wasn't angry. I was clinical. He had always played chess with broken pieces. He never realized the game was over before it started. I took the folder to our attorney. Quietly, without ceremony, we filed it all into record, securing legal closure on every front. My mother never asked about the details. She didn't need to. Her trust wasn't in the documents. It was in the life she had begun rebuilding. That's the thing about survivors. They don't stare at wreckage too long. They plant something new in the ashes. And every time she picked up a brush or laughed without looking over her shoulder, I saw her doing just that. Carl had also left behind one more thing, a storage unit in his name, filled with personal effects. The facility contacted us because my mother was still listed as the secondary contact. She wanted nothing from it, but I went. I unlocked the unit expecting to find furniture, junk, maybe some letters. What I found was far more revealing. Trophies from his past careers, photos of himself on stages, stacks of self-help books, with pages highlighted and notes scrawled in the margins. All of it screamed one thing: desperation to be someone. It struck me, in that dim fluorescent light, that Carl was never powerful. He was just afraid, and in that fear he tried to control everything around him, so no one would see how hollow he really was. That's why he lashed out at strength, mocked decency, and tried to isolate my mother, because in her he saw the life he could never sustain. And in me he saw the kind of man he could never become, not because of rank or medals, but because of restraint. I closed the storage unit and left without taking a single item. I informed the facility it could be cleared. Let someone else find value in his abandoned ego. I had no use for any of it. My victories weren't stored in boxes or sealed in frames. They were living, breathing moments of protection, of peace, of quiet power that asked for no applause. That, I realized, is the final form of justice. Not proving yourself to them, but becoming someone they'll never be able to reach again. Some weeks later, I returned home for a visit. The house felt different, not just quieter, but calmer. Like the air itself had memory, and it remembered who it used to belong to. My mother greeted me at the door, her hands covered in paint, a streak of blue across her cheek. She was glowing, not in a sentimental way, but in that grounded, sacred kind of glow that only comes when you've earned your freedom back one breath at a time. She had converted Carl's old den, the room where he once lorded over everything, into an art studio. The walls were now covered in color. Light spilled through the windows where blackout curtains once hung. There were brushes, music, the scent of oil and turpentine, and right in the middle stood a canvas, with an unfinished painting of a quiet lake under a storm. She looked at it, smiled, and said, "It's not done, but I like where it's going." That's all healing ever is, I thought. Not done, but going. That room used to be a fortress, now it was a sanctuary. That shift was the loudest kind of revenge, one painted in silence. Carl had built his identity around being unavoidable, but now, even his memory had been replaced by something softer, more permanent. And I realized in that moment, we don't always destroy what harms us by tearing it down. Sometimes we simply let something better take its place, until the old structure becomes irrelevant. I walked through the rest of the house, noting how my mother had reclaimed the space. Photos of my father were back on the walls. Books she loved sat openly on the shelves again. The furniture had changed, but not just in appearance. It had shed the invisible authority Carl once carried with him. There was no longer a his chair or his rules. The house no longer obeyed a presence. It responded to love, to peace, to laughter. That evening we sat on the porch and watched the sky turn gold. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. She looked over at me and said, "Do you think people like Carl ever understand what they've lost?" I thought about that for a moment, then answered, "Only for a second, but by then they've already lost everything worth holding on to." She nodded slowly, her eyes soft but certain. "Then let it be enough," she said, and it was. As night fell, I realized the war was over. Not just the conflict, but the emotional aftermath. I wasn't carrying him anymore. I wasn't rehearsing what I could have said, what I should have done, because I had done what mattered most. I had protected someone I loved. I had used silence like a sword, and I had walked away, not victorious, but free. Time has a strange way of sealing the edges around a wound you once thought would define you forever. I returned to service with a different kind of clarity, not sharper, but cleaner. There was no lingering bitterness, no fantasies of what could have been said. My mission had always been duty to country. But through Carl I'd learned what it meant to apply that same discipline to family, to use strategy, not to conquer, but to protect, to remain calm, even when every nerve screamed to retaliate. At headquarters, I was promoted again, Lieutenant General this time, but the stars on my shoulder didn't feel like personal triumphs. They felt like responsibility, and I wore them, thinking of my mother's quiet courage, of how she'd endured a man who tried to dominate her not with fists, but with fear, how she'd risen, not by fighting back loudly, but by remembering who she was in silence. I carried that lesson into every room I entered, every command I gave. One day I received word that Carl had died, a stroke, alone, in a rented trailer outside a forgotten town. No funeral arrangements, no obituary, just a phone call from a distant relative asking if I wanted to claim any of his belongings. I declined, not out of hate, but because there was nothing of him I needed to carry forward. His story had ended long before his body gave up. His true death was the day we stopped reacting, the day we stopped caring. I informed my mother gently. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. She just exhaled, slowly, like letting go of a weight she didn't realize was still pressing on her chest. Then she went back to her painting, adding golden streaks to a landscape I hadn't seen before. "This one's about peace," she said. I didn't need to ask whose. Some things are understood without words. That year, I took leave and returned to the town I once escaped, not to relive anything, but to build something new. I bought a small piece of land on the edge of the valley, built a quiet home, nothing grand, just a place to retreat when the noise of the world got too loud. I didn't need high walls or security systems. I had already fought my greatest battle and won it with silence. And that's where I write this now, from a porch that faces the sunset, where the wind carries no echoes of control, only the gentle rhythm of peace. I don't tell many people this story, not because it hurts, but because it's mine. And in a world obsessed with shouting victories from rooftops, I prefer the kind that end in silence, that close not with applause but with breath. The kind of victory you feel in your bones long after the war is over. The quiet that followed Carl's death wasn't eerie, it was sacred. It was like the world itself had acknowledged a chapter was closed, a weight lifted. But silence isn't emptiness, it's space. Space to think, to breathe, to build. In the absence of his presence, there was room again for truth. Not just the truth of what happened, but the deeper truth of who we'd always been beneath his shadow. My mother flourished in that silence, and so did I. She began teaching art classes at the community center. Young students, older widows, a few veterans' wives. Her work wasn't just painting, it was restoration. With every brushstroke she taught, she showed them how to reclaim their voices. One evening I visited one of her sessions. A student had painted a landscape of a tree standing alone in the middle of a storm. My mother walked over and said gently, "Sometimes the tree isn't trying to survive the storm, sometimes it is the storm." That line stuck with me. It still does. In my own life, I carried that wisdom into every leadership room. I didn't lead with intimidation, I led with presence. I gave fewer commands and asked better questions, and I could always tell who had never faced true opposition. Those who shouted the loudest, controlled the most, demanded loyalty they hadn't earned. Carl was in many of them. But I didn't judge, I just recognized, and I made sure I never became that man in anyone else's story. Eventually, I began giving talks, not just to military circles, but to civilian groups. My favorite was a small gathering of sons who'd grown up in homes with domineering father figures. I never told them my title, I just told them the truth, that silence is not surrender, and patience is not passivity. I told them that sometimes the greatest power you can hold is knowing exactly who you are, and never needing to prove it to anyone. One of them, a teenager, asked, "But what if you never get justice?" I smiled. "You don't always need it," I said. "Because when you've built a life that no longer needs their permission, they've already lost." That moment reminded me why I tell this story. Not for revenge, not for pride, but for those who still sit in the storm, unsure when it will pass. I tell it to show them the storm doesn't last. You do. And so, every morning I walk the path behind my house, past the wild oak trees my father once taught me to identify. I don't carry grief. I don't carry Carl. I carry peace, earned, hard-won, not given by the courts or the public, or even the military, but carved in quiet defiance when no one was watching. I don't wear that as a badge. I wear it as a truth. And that, to me, is legacy. I've often thought about what Carl would say if he could see how things ended, if he'd still believe he was the center of the universe, even as the sky turned away from him. But the truth is, I don't think about him much anymore. That's not because I've forgotten. It's because he's finally in the place where all manipulators eventually arrive, irrelevant. And for men like him, irrelevance is the one punishment they never see coming. The final move, as it turns out, was never mine. It was his. His choice to push too far. His choice to mistake silence for submission. His choice to challenge someone who had already mapped the exit while pretending to stay seated. And when he slammed those handcuffs onto my wrists, thinking he was proving his authority, he didn't realize he was pulling the pin on his own downfall. That moment didn't expose me. It revealed him. I didn't retaliate. I didn't roar. I let the world see who he was, and then I let him fall into the hole he dug. In time, people stopped even mentioning him. His name was replaced in stories with silence or with shrugs. He wasn't hated. He was just gone. No legacy, no memory worth repeating. And that perhaps is the greatest undoing for someone who tried so hard to dominate. He wanted fear, he left behind forgetfulness. And no revenge could ever match that kind of vanishing. As for me, I don't tell this story for applause. I share it only when someone needs to hear it, when they've been pushed into quiet corners and need to be reminded that silence is not weakness. It is preparation. It is discipline. It is a strategy carved out by those who understand that the loudest move is often the last one you never have to make. I don't walk with vengeance in my heart. I walk with wisdom. I walk with the lessons etched into the quiet glances I shared with my mother after Carl's exit, the unspoken victories, the days we spent rebuilding with no audience, no confetti, just calm. That's what real power looks like. It doesn't demand. It doesn't parade. It endures. And so I sit here now, watching the sun rise over the field behind my house, coffee in hand, no headlines to chase, just the sound of wind in the trees, the kind of wind that once roared and now whispers. It carries a message I hope someone out there hears. You don't have to destroy them, just outlast them, and then live so well that their memory fades in the shadow of your peace.